Hello, dear listener. Tonight, we invite you to journey with us through the quiet corridors and gardens of a castle where time seems to move slowly, and every detail holds a story. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm, immersive tales, please subscribing. It helps us share more serene stories for your evenings. Now, let's settle in, take a deep breath, and allow the soft rhythm of history to guide you into gentle relaxation. In the soft light of dawn, the hills of Upper Hungary were veiled in silver mist. A lone castle stood above the valleys, tall, silent, and ancient, its towers reaching into the pale morning sky. The castle was called Szeged. And within its stone walls, in the summer of 1560, a child was born into one of the most powerful families of the realm. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory. The Bathorys were no ordinary nobles. Their bloodline was woven through the courts of Transylvania and Poland, through bishops, soldiers, and kings. Their crest, a dragon biting its own tail, was a symbol of eternal power. And it was whispered that their blood carried both brilliance and darkness. As a little girl, Elizabeth would walk through the long corridors of the castle, tracing the patterns in the old tapestries, listening to the echoes of her own footsteps. She was curious, quiet, and watchful, a child who noticed everything but said little. Outside her windows, the forests were endless, their shadows shifting like secrets. Inside, the world was ordered, strict, and full of expectations. Her tutors taught her Latin and Greek, politics and philosophy. She read letters from distant cousins serving in royal courts, and at night she would sit by the window, looking down at the lanterns flickering in the village below. The peasants called the castle the Stone Crown, and they bowed when they saw her family crest. Even as a child, Elizabeth understood that her world was built on loyalty and fear, two forces that often felt the same. And so her story began, not with cruelty, but with silence. With a young girl watching the world through glass windows, learning the language of power long before she would ever speak it aloud. Years passed like the slow turning of seasons. By the time Elizabeth was 13, she had already learned the subtle art of stillness, how to listen when others spoke too much, how to remember when others forgot. Her family's estate stretched across fields and forests, villages and rivers, each bound to the Bathory name by generations of fealty. The household was vast. Servants moved quietly through the halls like whispers of wind. Her governess, a stern woman named Ilona, insisted that a noblewoman's strength came not from her temper, but from her patience. Power, she said, is rarely loud. It waits. In those quiet days, Elizabeth learned to read people the way others read letters, studying gestures, tones, and the smallest hesitations. Visitors came and went, knights, ambassadors, men from Vienna who spoke of the emperor's wars, and women in velvet gowns who carried rumors from the royal court. Through it all, Elizabeth remained composed. Yet when she walked through the gardens at dusk, something restless stirred inside her. The roses leaned toward the fading light, the air smelled of iron and rain. The hills beyond the castle were alive with distant thunder, not storms, but wars being fought far away, shaping the future she was destined to enter. At 15, she was promised in marriage to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, heir to another powerful Hungarian family. He was older, a soldier known for his skill and his cold discipline. The match was political, of course. Love had little place in such unions. Still, when Elizabeth met him for the first time, she found his presence oddly magnetic, quiet, almost severe, but steady. His voice was low, his posture perfect, his gaze unreadable. The wedding was a grand affair, attended by nobles from across the kingdom. Candles burned for 3 nights straight, and the air was heavy with the scent of wine and lilacs. Elizabeth stood beside her new husband, her gown embroidered with silver thread, her hair braided with pearls. As music echoed through the great hall, she glanced at him, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not a man, but a mirror. Someone else who understood the weight of expectation, the loneliness of inherited power. After the wedding, they moved to his estate at Sarver, a castle older and darker than her childhood home. The corridors were narrow, the walls damp with age. At night, when the torches burned low, the sound of the wind in the chimneys resembled whispers. It was there, in that dim and ancient place, that Elizabeth began to grow into herself. She managed the estate when her husband was away at war, writing letters, overseeing harvests, settling disputes. Villagers came to her for justice, nobles came to her for influence. And though she was still young, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had always known her place in the world. But behind her calm, something fragile shimmered, a sense that time was a delicate thing, that peace never lasted long. Each evening, as she stood by the window of her chamber, she would watch the last light fade from the hills, and the reflection of her own face would appear in the glass, distant, luminous, and unreadable. The villagers began to whisper about the Lady of Sarver, that she was beautiful, brilliant, and perhaps a little strange. They called her the Silent Countess. And though no one could see it yet, the silence around her was beginning to hum with something new, something waiting to awaken. The castle at Sarver stood on a quiet plain, surrounded by forests that stretched toward the horizon. In summer, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and river mist. In winter, it was the color of frost and stone. Life there followed a rhythm as steady as breath, the sound of bells marking prayer, the footsteps of servants, the rustle of parchment as Elizabeth read by candlelight. Count Ferenc Nadesti, her husband, was rarely home. He served the Habsburg crown as a commander in the long wars against the Ottoman Empire. Letters came from him every few weeks, short, precise, written in a hand that looked more like carved lines than ink. He spoke of fortresses and snow, of men and duty, and of how proud he was of her management of their lands. When those letters arrived, Elizabeth would read them slowly, tracing his words with her fingertips before sealing them again in ribbon. She would sit near the fire afterward, her thoughts drifting between the men she married and the men she barely knew. The household looked to her for guidance, and she gave it calmly. She spoke softly, but people listened. Disputes between farmers, late harvests, small illnesses, everything passed through her judgment. She kept the accounts, trained the servants, and organized aid for the nearby villages. And yet, for all her control, the nights were long. Sometimes, when the wind pressed against the shutters, she would imagine the sound of distant battle, the echo of drums that never truly reached her but seemed to tremble in the air. She would lie awake, her eyes tracing the patterns of moonlight on the ceiling, her mind wandering far beyond the walls of the castle. It was in these quiet hours that she began to dream differently. Her dreams were full of corridors that led nowhere, mirrors that showed faces not her own, voices that spoke in languages she did not understand. They were not frightening, but strange, like memories belonging to someone else. In the mornings, she would rise before dawn, put on a plain gown, and walk through the gardens alone. She liked the cold. It kept her awake, grounded, real. The roses were long gone in winter, but the branches glittered with frost like silver veins. When messengers brought news from the war, the servants would gather in the hall to listen. Elizabeth remained composed no matter the report, victory, loss, delay, she reacted the same way, with silence. Some mistook it for indifference, others saw it as strength. But inside her, a quiet ache began to take root. Years passed in this rhythm, letters and seasons, waiting and watching. And when Ferenc finally returned, the castle changed. His presence filled the air like iron and smoke. He was taller than she remembered, his voice deeper, his eyes sharp as flint. He had become a man of command, molded by battle and discipline. At first, they circled each other like strangers reacquainting after a long dream. But in time, a certain respect formed between them, not passion, but a kind of understanding. They dined together in near silence, discussed the management of lands, spoke of the empire and its politics. And at night, when the fire burned low, she would sometimes see him watching the flames, his expression distant, haunted by something she could not name. In those moments, Elizabeth began to understand that power, real power, was never only about wealth or blood. It was also about loneliness. And so she learned to carry both, the crown and the silence, as if they were the same. The year was 1583 when Elizabeth first traveled to Vienna. Snow lay thick along the road, muffling the sound of wheels and hooves. The journey took days, and each night they stayed in cold manor houses where frost gathered on the windowpanes and the scent of pine smoke lingered in the air. For most of her life, Elizabeth had lived among stone and quiet fields. But Vienna, the imperial capital, was another world. Its streets glimmered with lanterns, its carriages rolled endlessly, and its air carried the sound of bells and voices in a dozen tongues. The Habsburg court was dazzling, ornate, and heavy with ceremony. Every bow, every glance, every smile carried meaning. Elizabeth moved through it with the same still composure she had learned as a girl. She watched and listened, to the ladies whispering behind fans, to the courtiers trading compliments like coins, to the musicians playing under chandeliers that sparkled like frozen light. The emperor's palace was vast, filled with portraits of ancestors in gilded frames. Elizabeth often found herself staring at them, wondering if the painted eyes could still see. At court, she was admired for her beauty, pale skin, dark eyes, and a calm that seemed almost unearthly. Some found it enchanting, others unsettling. She wore dark velvet gowns that caught the candlelight like ripples on still water. The women of the court gossiped about her, that she spoke 5 languages, that she read more than most men, that she was kind but distant. Some said her silence meant wisdom, others whispered that it hid something they could not name. Elizabeth did not mind. She had learned long ago that mystery was a kind of armor. Her husband Ferenc remained mostly at war, appearing in Vienna only briefly. When they were seen together, they seemed perfectly matched, the stern soldier and the serene lady. Yet between them lingered an invisible wall, built not from anger, but from the years of distance that had shaped them. Still, in the rare evenings they spent alone, he would sometimes tell her of the stars he had seen above the battlefields, how quiet they were, how eternal. And for a moment, the war would seem far away, and they would sit together in silence, watching the snow fall outside the window. By spring, Elizabeth returned to Sarver, carrying with her a new kind of knowledge, not of books or letters, but of people. She had seen how easily power could be worn like a costume, and how quickly favor could turn to shadow. In the stillness of her own castle, she began to prefer the quiet once more. But sometimes, late at night, she dreamed of those glittering halls, and of the faces that smiled without ever showing their true thoughts. Years drifted on, each season folding into the next like pages in a slow-moving book. Ferenc was away more often than ever, leading campaigns along the borderlands. The wars had become endless, sometimes victorious, sometimes cruelly uncertain. At Sarver, Elizabeth's authority deepened. She managed vast lands, oversaw trade, collected taxes, and settled disputes between villages. She rode on horseback through the estates, accompanied by guards, her cloak trailing behind her like a dark wing. To the peasants, she seemed both distant and divine, a noblewoman who ruled with quiet certainty. But her rule was not without compassion. She provided grain to the poor during harsh winters, built a small chapel for the servants, and supported scholars who traveled through her lands. Letters from Vienna called her wise beyond her years. And yet, the castle still echoed with silence. At night, she would sit by the window with a candle, reading poetry and old chronicles. She wrote letters to her husband, never sentimental, but thoughtful, filled with careful observations of her lands and the state of her household. She asked little of him, only news of his health. The servants said the lady of Sarver slept little, that her candle burned until dawn. But those who saw her by day found her calm, poised, radiant in her restraint. As years passed, she bore several children, each birth a quiet celebration, each child sent to be educated in noble houses, as tradition required. Her household grew, filled with nurses, tutors, and attendants. The rhythms of daily life continued, the ringing of bells, the washing of linens, the measured steps of guards. It was peaceful in its way, the peace of discipline, of order. But sometimes, when the castle corridors emptied at night and the firelight trembled on the walls, Elizabeth would feel something shift. A strange sense of fragility, like glass beneath pressure. She could not name it, only sense that beneath the calm surface of her life, something unseen was waiting. One night, she found herself walking alone through the great hall. The moonlight fell across the marble floor in pale streaks. She paused before a mirror, one she had brought from Vienna, framed in silver. Her reflection stared back, serene and still. Yet for a heartbeat, she thought she saw something else, the faintest shimmer of age, of time, of something watching her from behind the glass. She blinked, and it was gone. When morning came, she said nothing of it. She resumed her duties as always, precise, composed, and endlessly graceful. But in the quiet corners of her mind, the thought lingered, that even in the stillest rooms, the air can tremble. And sometimes, it is not the world that moves, but the soul itself. The wars dragged on like an endless winter. Each year brought news of new battles, shifting borders, and uncertain peace. Messengers came and went from Sarver, their cloaks dusted with snow or mud depending on the season. They carried letters from Count Nadesty, written in his careful, rigid script, folded with military precision. Elizabeth would open them in her private chamber, by the same window where she had once waited for him as a girl. His words were distant yet sincere. He spoke of discipline, of loyalty to the emperor, of lands defended and soldiers lost. And always, he thanked her for her stewardship, for keeping their estate strong in his absence. She responded in kind, polite, clear, restrained. Her letters were full of numbers, harvest reports, and village news. Sometimes, though rarely, she added a line of poetry, or a quiet thought about time, or fate. Seasons changed. Children grew. The castle aged as all things do, its walls thick with memories, its corridors heavy with silence. During this time, Elizabeth became not just a noblewoman, but a force of her own. She was respected by her peers and feared by those who crossed her. Her judgment was quick but fair. She understood the value of order, not as cruelty, but as necessity. When peasants came to her for justice, she listened. She never raised her voice. But her gaze was sharp enough to cut through excuses. And when she walked through the halls, her presence alone made people straighten their backs, as though the air itself demanded respect. Still, beneath the calm surface, loneliness remained, not as a wound, but as a quiet constant, like the hum of wind through the old stones. At night, she sometimes dreamed of her husband's battlefields, endless plains, the glint of steel, the slow march of horses under gray skies. She would wake before dawn, unable to tell if what she felt was fear or longing. And as she stood before the mirror to braid her hair, she often thought, perhaps both are the same. In the spring of 1601, after nearly 2 decades of war, Ferenc returned home for the last time. He was changed, older, slower, his once dark hair touched with silver. The years had left their mark, not in scars, but in silence. When they spoke, their words were few, but their understanding was deep. They no longer needed explanations, they shared the same quiet weariness of those who had lived too long in duty's shadow. That summer, they rode together through the fields. The wind was warm, the wheat high, and the sound of the river was soft in the distance. For a rare moment, Elizabeth felt at peace. She did not know it would be their last ride together. The winter that followed was cold beyond memory. Snow lay so thick upon the roofs that even the church bells sounded muted. It was that year, in the depth of frost, that Ferenc Nadesti fell ill. The doctors came, men in heavy cloaks carrying bottles and instruments that glinted like frost. They spoke in whispers and moved with care. Elizabeth stayed by his side through it all, her expression calm, her eyes steady, though sleepless nights hollowed the light from her face. He spoke little in those final days, his voice a faint echo of the man he had once been. One evening, as the fire burned low, he turned to her and said only, "Keep the house." And she did. When he died, the bells of Sarver tolled slowly through the snow. The sound rolled across the fields, heavy and final. The castle fell into stillness. Servants moved in silence. The children, too young to understand the permanence of death, wept softly in the chapel. Elizabeth stood through it all, veiled in black, her hands folded, her gaze distant. Grief did not make her crumble. It turned her to stone. For weeks after the funeral, she wandered the empty corridors of the castle. His chair still by the fire, his gloves still resting on the table, his letters still tied with ribbon in her desk. The world felt at once enormous and hollow. In the months that followed, something in her changed, not sharply, but slowly, like ice forming on water. She became quieter, even to those closest to her. She withdrew from court, from visits, from gatherings. Instead, she returned to her other estate, Sedge Castle, the place of her birth, now hers once more. It was said that when she arrived, the villagers knelt as she passed, for they had not seen their lady in years. The castle stood upon the hill, its towers cutting the mist like memory-made stone. And when the torches were lit that night, the valley below seemed to glow with her return. Elizabeth looked up at the walls that had watched her grow, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to comfort. She was alone, but not afraid. For solitude had become her oldest companion, and in its quiet, she could finally hear the softest of truths, that power and loss were not opposites, but reflections of one another. As the first snow fell over Sedge, she closed her eyes and let the cold settle over her like a crown. Spring came late that year. The snow melted reluctantly, and when it finally did, it revealed a world of quiet renewal. The hills turned green again, and the river below the castle ran swift and silver, carrying the scent of pine and wet stone. From her balcony, Elizabeth Bathory watched the thaw with steady calm. She was 40 years old now, neither young nor old by the measure of her time, but seasoned by loss, by leadership, by the stillness that follows great change. Sedge Castle had aged with her. Its walls were strong, its towers graceful, its great hall full of soft echoes. She walked those halls each morning, her hand tracing the carved wood of doorframes, her mind turning endlessly over thoughts of the past and the shape of what was yet to come. The kingdom was restless. Rumors of shifting alliances moved through the courts like shadows. Yet in her estates, life remained orderly. Under her rule, the lands prospered, harvests were fair, mills were busy, and trade routes safe. She received visitors from neighboring estates, lords, widows, stewards, all eager for her counsel. They spoke to her not as to a fragile woman, but as to a figure of quiet authority. She listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, her words carried weight. Sometimes she would walk to the village below, cloaked in dark velvet, her steps sure on the uneven stones. The peasants bowed deeply, and though her presence filled them with awe, there was no fear in it, only reverence. She asked after their children, their crops, their weather. Small things, but spoken with genuine interest. At night, she wrote letters by candlelight, to her cousins in Transylvania, to her daughters now married into other noble houses, and to her sons, who studied law and diplomacy. Her handwriting was elegant and deliberate, every word chosen like a stone laid into a foundation. Yet sometimes, as the flame trembled and the hour grew late, she would pause, quill in hand, her gaze unfocused, listening, perhaps, not to sound but to memory. In those moments, the castle seemed to breathe with her, its old stones remembering everything she did not speak aloud. It was during one of these nights that her steward brought word of a royal invitation. The Queen of Hungary herself sought Elizabeth's company at court. She folded the letter and smiled faintly. The world, it seemed, had not forgotten her name. Budapest shimmered like a dream. When Elizabeth arrived, the city was alive with early summer, carriages clattering along cobbled streets, the air filled with the scent of linden trees and distant music. The royal palace stood high above the river, its domes gilded, its corridors alive with laughter and perfume. The queen received her with grace and curiosity. Elizabeth, draped in mourning black trimmed with pearls, bowed with a precision that was both humble and commanding. They spoke of many things, the border wars, the estates, the question of inheritance that troubled so many noble families. In the candlelight of the royal hall, Elizabeth seemed untouched by time. Whispers followed her like the rustle of silk, admiration, speculation, the faint envy of those who had aged less gracefully. At court, alliances were as fragile as lace. Every smile carried meaning, every silence a secret. Yet Elizabeth moved through it with ease, her poise unshaken, her eyes calm and distant. She had seen too much of real life to be dazzled by its performance. Still, something in her softened. The music, the laughter, the scent of candles, they stirred a part of her she had long kept still. For a few nights, she allowed herself to remember what it was to feel admired, to be seen not as a widow or a ruler, but simply as a woman. Among the courtiers was a scholar, Miklos, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers and the thoughtful eyes of one who lived more in books than in the world. He was charged with maintaining the Queen's archives but found himself drawn into long conversations with Elizabeth about history, poetry, and the nature of legacy. They would walk through the palace gardens at dusk, the air heavy with the scent of roses. He listened as she spoke of her lands, her family, her memories of war and peace. And she, in turn, listened to his thoughts on philosophy, on the strange duty of remembering what others forget. When she left the court at summer's end, Miklos presented her with a single gift, a book bound in dark leather, filled with his notes on Hungarian history. Inside the cover, he had written a single line. For the lady who carries centuries in her gaze. She said nothing, only closed the book gently and looked out the window of her carriage as the palace grew smaller behind her. The river glimmered below like a ribbon of light, and the hills of home called to her once more. That night, when she returned to Sejd, she placed the book upon her desk beside the letters of her husband, one life's chapter closing, another quietly beginning. Autumn returned with its gold and gray light. The fields around Sejd turned copper and russet, and the forest whispered like an old friend. Life within the castle settled into a rhythm both peaceful and solemn, a rhythm that belonged entirely to Elizabeth now. She rose with the dawn. The servants would hear her footsteps before they saw her, soft yet certain, moving through the echoing halls. She would stand by the great window of the west tower, watching mist climb from the valley, the village roofs hidden beneath pale ribbons of cloud. Letters came and went, bearing tidings from her children, from the court, from distant kin. She answered every one in her fine, deliberate hand. The ink on her desk was never dry. Her steward, János, managed the day-to-day matters of her estate, taxes, disputes, harvest reports. He was loyal and cautious, a man who understood that his lady's approval was worth more than gold. To the villagers, Elizabeth seemed untouchable, a figure halfway between legend and law. Yet to those who worked closely beside her, she was calm, thoughtful, and precise, not cruel, but exacting. At night, she read by candlelight, philosophy, scripture, the writings of Erasmus and Machiavelli, whose words she underlined in the margins with quiet fascination. Sometimes she copied passages into her own notebooks, adding reflections in her steady, graceful script. Her world had become one of reflection and memory, like a room filled with mirrors facing one another, endless depth, endless stillness. Outside the castle walls, however, whispers began to grow. Some said the Lady of Sedgemoor was too powerful, too wealthy, too private. Others, envious of her influence, hinted at strange habits, unseen guests, nocturnal studies. It was nothing more than rumor, the kind that follows all great women who live beyond the reach of ordinary judgment. Elizabeth ignored them. She had weathered worse in her youth, and she knew that in the courts of men, independence was always mistaken for mystery. Yet sometimes, when the wind howled across the towers and candles flickered for no reason, she felt the weight of eyes unseen, not of ghosts, but of history itself, forever watching those who dared to live differently. In the evenings, she would walk the ramparts alone. From there, she could see the faint lights of the village below, the distant sparkle of other estates. The world was wide and full of movement, but from her hill, it seemed to pause, as though even time itself bowed before her stillness. One winter, when the snow came early and heavy, a letter arrived from the royal city. It bore the seal of Count Georgi Thurzo, a man of influence and old family, once her ally, now a representative of the king. He wrote with politeness, but beneath the courtesy was a question, sharp and unmistakable: why had the Lady of Sedgemoor withdrawn southwest completely from court life? Elizabeth read the letter by the fire. The ink was faint, the handwriting deliberate. She smiled, not with amusement, but with understanding. In the world she inhabited, curiosity was never innocent. That night, she answered, "I am well, my lord. The affairs of my estate are many, and my peace lies not in the noise of courts but in the silence of work. What is built quietly endures." Weeks passed before the reply came. This time, Thurzo's words were warmer. He had always admired her intelligence, he wrote, and asked whether she might assist him in a matter of land dispute near the border, a gesture both political and personal. It was the beginning of a correspondence that would last for years, a slow exchange of formality and subtle respect. In those letters, Elizabeth's mind revealed its full strength, analytical, persuasive, always just a step beyond her peers. Yet within her private journals, the ones no one would read for centuries, her tone softened. She wrote of solitude, of memory, of the strange way the past could echo like music through the present. She confessed not sorrow, but weariness, a kind of gentle fatigue that came from always having to be the strong one, the wise one, the unyielding one. Sometimes, as she finished her writing, she would glance at the book Miklos had once given her, the pages now yellowed, the ink faint. She would touch its cover lightly and whisper, "For the lady who carries centuries in her gaze." Outside, snow fell over the castle roofs. The village below slept beneath its quiet white crown. And within the great house of Sedgemoor, the woman the world would one day call a legend sat at her desk, writing into the stillness, not knowing that history was already listening. The years passed, yet Elizabeth's presence remained unshakable. At Sedgemoor, her influence extended quietly but firmly. She met with local lords and landowners, advised them on governance, and settled disputes with an elegance that left all parties feeling heard. Her counsel was respected far beyond her own estate, and word of her intellect and fairness traveled slowly through the region. The castle itself became a hub of quiet power. Scholars, advisors, and travelers came to seek her perspective. Letters arrived from faraway courts, asking for her guidance on matters of diplomacy, law, and family alliances. Every word she wrote was measured, deliberate, a reflection of years spent observing and learning the delicate balance of authority. In her private chambers, she spent hours among maps, charts, and old manuscripts. She would trace the boundaries of estates with her finger, imagining the flow of trade, the movement of people, and the subtle connections that held kingdoms together. The villagers and servants saw only the calm, composed lady who moved through the halls with the certainty of someone who belonged entirely to her place. Yet behind the quiet facade, Elizabeth considered the weight of each decision. She understood that influence was not enforced by force, but by respect, attention, and subtle persuasion. Even the royal court, distant as it was, felt her presence in quiet ripples. Invitations came, some politely refused, others accepted with caution. She was no longer merely a widow, she was a figure whose judgment mattered, whose opinion carried significance. And as she sat by the window at night, watching the moonlight ripple across the snow-laden towers, she reflected on the strange paradox of her life: solitude and power, silence and authority, all intertwined in a way that made the world both wider and narrower at once. Despite her distance, whispers of the royal court occasionally reached Sejd. Nobles traveling through the region spoke of her in hushed tones, praising her intelligence, her foresight, and her unwavering composure. Some admired her, others speculated, trying to divine what made her so formidable. Elizabeth received one such letter from a young nobleman recently appointed to a minor office in Vienna. He wrote of the subtle games at court, of alliances and rivalries, and sought her insight. She responded carefully, her words measured to convey authority without unnecessary disclosure. It was during this time that she began to notice the intricate dance of perception. One could accomplish much with a word chosen carefully, a gesture made just so. Influence was like a tapestry, woven slowly, each thread delicate, each connection meaningful. The castle at Sejd became a quiet study of such connections. Guests were welcomed politely, conversations recorded in memory, each detail noted and reflected upon. And all the while, Elizabeth maintained the stillness that had become her signature, a calm surface beneath which her mind observed everything, always attentive, always discerning. She found comfort in this rhythm. Days passed like pages turning slowly in a book. Letters arrived, meetings concluded, seasons changed, and yet the world beyond the walls could not disturb the ordered quiet of her domain. Still, even as she moved through her routine with grace, a faint tension lingered in her mind, the subtle, almost imperceptible awareness that the world of courts, nobles, and distant monarchs was never truly static. And though she remained serene, she could sense the threads of ambition and curiosity stretching outward, ready to touch her name. At night, she would walk alone in the gardens, watching the moonlight drift over the fountains and hedges. The air was crisp, the stars reflected on the frozen ponds, and for a few moments, she allowed herself to simply be, the Lady of Sejd, calm and attentive, alone but entirely herself. Time settled over Sejd like a soft blanket. Elizabeth moved through the castle as if guided by its walls themselves, each corridor and chamber familiar and alive with memory. The turning of the seasons marked her days, snow softening into spring rain, spring into golden summer, summer into amber autumn, and autumn into the hush of winter once more. She kept careful records of her lands, harvests, weather patterns, the growth of crops, and the state of livestock. She observed the villagers' routines, noting their strengths and challenges, their joys and quiet sorrows. Her presence was steady, unassuming, yet deeply authoritative. In the long evenings, she would sit by the window with a warm cup of tea or wine, gazing out at the hills. Her gaze lingered on the forests, rivers, and fields, following the subtle changes of nature as if she were reading a living book. Her mind, calm yet ever curious, wandered through history as she read manuscripts brought by traveling scholars. Tales of distant lands, of kings and queens, of battles and alliances, all fascinated her, yet she studied them quietly, without haste, allowing the wisdom of the past to settle gently into her understanding of the present. In these years, she became known not just as a noblewoman, but as a wise lady whose judgments were sought even by those far from her estate. Her correspondence grew longer, more detailed, filled with reflections on governance, philosophy, and the subtle currents of human nature. Though her life was serene, there was a pulse beneath the calm, a subtle awareness that even quiet power required attention, vigilance, and the soft strength to act without haste. Even in the peaceful expanse of Sejd, stories began to grow like ivy on stone. Servants whispered of the lady's intelligence, her composure, and the careful way she managed everything from the smallest disputes to the grandest decisions. Travelers told of her elegance and wisdom, and over time, her name carried a quiet legend beyond the walls of her castle. Elizabeth was aware of these murmurs, though she neither encouraged nor discouraged them. She understood the rhythm of reputation, how it moved through whispers, letters, and fleeting glances. Some stories were flattering, others tinged with speculation, but none reached her as threats. They were shadows, soft and distant, against the steady light of her daily life. Her children visited when they could, bringing news of marriages, new alliances, and the changing world. Elizabeth received them warmly, yet her focus remained on the estate and her correspondence. She guided her family gently, instilling in them patience, reflection, and a sense of responsibility that matched her own calm authority. At night, she walked through the castle halls, her footsteps echoing softly. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to bend and shift with her movements. In those hours, she allowed herself to think deeply, to remember the years that had passed, and to consider the quiet influence she had gathered. Though the world beyond Sejd shifted and changed, she remained a steadfast observer. Every letter, every visitor, every shadow on the wall became part of the careful tapestry of her life. And in the stillness of her private chambers, she would close her eyes and feel the gentle pulse of time, slow, steady, and entirely hers. By now, Sejd was more than a castle, it was a living testament to Elizabeth's care and intelligence. Fields stretched wide and orderly, orchards bore fruit in abundance, and the mills hummed with steady rhythm. Villagers tended their homes with pride, knowing that their lady walked among them not as a distant figure, but as a quiet guide who watched over their lives with attention and fairness. Elizabeth rose with the sun and often rode through the estate, her cloak dark against the pale morning light. She observed the flow of work, the growth of crops, and the patterns of daily life with a scholar's eye and a mother's patience. Every detail mattered, not for control alone, but for the harmony of the land she nurtured. The castle halls echoed with learning. Tutors arrived for the children, and scholars came to study the manuscripts in her library. Elizabeth delighted in conversation with minds that challenged hers, discussing philosophy, history, and the subtle workings of governance. These discussions were quiet and deliberate, never rushed, leaving both participants thoughtful long after the words had faded. At night, she would wander the gardens and terraces, watching the moonlight shimmer across fountains and frozen ponds. Sometimes she paused to listen, not for sound, but for the quiet rhythm of life, the invisible pulse that flowed through her lands. In these moments, she felt the calm satisfaction of purpose, of a life lived carefully and deliberately, a life in which every action mattered yet nothing demanded haste. Though Elizabeth rarely left Sedged, her presence was felt far beyond its walls. Nobles and officials spoke of her wisdom, her steady hand, and the way she seemed to understand people without needing to ask. Courtiers at distant palaces mentioned her with respect. Travelers carried tales of her judgment and composure through the countryside. Yet rumors, gentle as they were, began to gather in whispers. Some admired her brilliance, others speculated on her solitude. In the long corridors of Sedged, servants noticed the attention she drew without seeming to seek it. Shadows of curiosity followed her, like soft echoes in the halls. Elizabeth paid little mind. She understood the quiet dance of perception. Reputation was not a thing one chased, it was a reflection, delicate and intricate, of the life one lived. And hers, carefully tended, had grown deep roots in the minds of those who knew her, and even those who only heard of her. Her daily routine continued, steady and composed: letters, management of the estate, study, and reflection. Occasionally, she wrote to the royal court, offering counsel or insight in measured, elegant language. Each letter was an extension of her calm authority, reinforcing the quiet influence she had cultivated over decades. At night, she would sit by her candle, pen in hand, gazing at the flame as it flickered across the pages. The castle around her breathed softly, the wind drifting through towers and corridors, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and distant village life. And in those quiet hours, Elizabeth allowed herself to rest in the knowledge that she had lived fully within her world, not loudly, not recklessly, but entirely with intention and grace. Time moved slowly at Sedged, measured by seasons, the slow swell of rivers, and the light shifting across the hills. Elizabeth, now in her later 40s, carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had mastered patience and observation. Every movement she made, from the way she walked through the corridors to the way she held her pen over parchment, reflected decades of careful attention. The castle had grown familiar to her in ways deeper than walls and stones. She knew where the drafts gathered in winter, which windows caught the first rays of spring sun, and which doors creaked only on stormy nights. These details, unnoticed by most, were part of the rhythm of her life, a life lived slowly, deliberately, and with an awareness that even small changes could ripple outward. Her children had grown, married into other noble families, and visited occasionally, bringing with them news of distant lands, political shifts, and the changing tides of the empire. Elizabeth received them with calm composure, listening carefully, offering guidance without imposing her will. She understood that wisdom was not about dominance but about the patient shaping of decisions and lives. At night, the castle seemed to breathe with her. She walked through the halls alone, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone floors. In the library, she would study manuscripts brought by traveling scholars, ancient texts, philosophical treatises, accounts of distant courts. She read slowly, savoring each sentence, allowing the ideas to settle gently into her understanding. The villagers continued to respect her authority, approaching her with both admiration and a gentle deference. They knew her presence meant balance, fairness, and care. And yet, within her, a quiet solitude persisted. It was not loneliness, exactly, but a deep sense that some aspects of life, memory, thought, legacy, could only be held alone. She often reflected on the years gone by, the long winters, the distant wars, the visits to Vienna, the letters from her husband, the careful management of estates. Each memory felt like a stone in a foundation, each choice a brick laid carefully into the structure of her life. Sometimes, when snow fell and the wind pressed against the castle walls, she would stand at the window and watch the valley below. The village lights shimmered softly through the haze, and she allowed herself a moment of stillness, to feel the quiet pulse of the world and her place within it, unhurried and undisturbed. Spring returned slowly, carrying the first scent of lilacs and freshly tilled soil. The gardens of Sejd were alive again, tulips and roses, herbs and lavender, all tended under Elizabeth's watchful eye. She walked the paths every morning, observing the growth of each plant, noting the subtle changes that marked the passage of time. It was during these walks that her thoughts drifted freely. She thought of her husband, of the letters that had once traveled back and forth like silent messengers of care and duty. She thought of her children and their families, of the scholars who had come to learn from her, and of the quiet influence she had maintained across decades. Her reflection in the garden's small ponds reminded her of the years that had shaped her. The face that stared back was composed, calm, and unyielding, yet carried the soft traces of experience, the faint lines of worry, the quiet strength of endurance, the knowledge that life's depth was measured not by dramatic events, but by the consistent, deliberate way one lived each day. The castle itself seemed to share her calm. The halls, the towers, the stones, all carried the memory of her presence. Candles burned along the corridors at night, casting a warm glow that softened the edges of shadows. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying distant echoes of life in the village below. In her study, she often wrote letters to distant friends, nobles, and scholars. Her words were precise, elegant, and measured, full of wisdom and reflection. Yet within these letters, one could sense a gentle curiosity, an awareness of the wider world and the subtle movements of power, life, and human nature. Elizabeth's legend, even at this stage, was growing quietly. Stories of her wisdom, fairness, and composure traveled through the villages and across estates. People whispered of the Lady of Sejd with reverence, admiration, and a hint of mystery. Yet she herself paid little attention, focusing instead on the rhythm of her days, the seasons, the letters, the gardens, the slow unfolding of life under her care. And when the sun set over the hills, casting a golden glow across the fields and the castle walls, she would pause in the garden. She allowed herself to breathe, to feel the world in its quiet motion, and to recognize the life she had built, steady, enduring, and entirely her own. As the years passed, Elizabeth's presence at Sejd became a quiet anchor for all who lived on her lands. Her days were filled with careful routines, reading and writing in her library, tending to correspondence, walking through the gardens, and observing the villagers' daily lives. Each activity was deliberate, measured, and carried with the dignity of a life well lived. She often thought of the lessons she had learned in her youth, the fleeting nature of favor at court, the delicate balance of power, and the importance of calm observation. These lessons guided her in all decisions, from settling disputes between neighbors to planning the long-term management of her estates. Her children, now grown, visited occasionally, bringing news of distant courts, new alliances, and the changing currents of politics. Elizabeth received them with gentle curiosity, offering insight without overbearing authority. She had learned that true influence came not from command alone, but from careful guidance and measured counsel. At night, she would sit by the fire in her private chambers, reading philosophy and poetry, occasionally writing reflections in her journals. The flame danced softly across the pages, casting shadows on the walls that seemed almost alive. She welcomed these quiet hours, moments to think, to remember, and to understand the subtle rhythms of the world around her. In the distance, the village slept beneath the stars, its lights twinkling like soft lanterns. Elizabeth knew that her life had created a network of care and attention that extended far beyond the castle walls, a legacy that was as enduring as the stones themselves. Yet she never let herself rest fully in pride. She understood that wisdom was not static, it was a living process, requiring observation, patience, and the ability to adapt. And so, each day, she continued to watch, to write, and to reflect, quietly shaping the life of her estate with the same steady hand that had guided her for decades. Winter settled over sedged with the hush of soft snow. The trees were bare, the fields white and silent, and the castle seemed wrapped in a blanket of stillness. Elizabeth walked through the halls slowly, her footsteps echoing softly against the cold stone. She carried no urgency, only the quiet rhythm of decades spent in careful observation and reflection. In the mornings, she read by the windows, watching the snow drift across the valley. She traced the paths of the villagers, noting how the frost affected travel, livestock, and work. Even in the coldest days, she found beauty in the small details, the way sunlight reflected on icicles, the faint tracks of animals in the snow, the gentle smoke rising from chimneys. Letters arrived from distant lands, from family, friends, and scholars seeking her counsel. She answered each thoughtfully, her words precise and deliberate, conveying both authority and kindness. Her writing reflected the years of experience, the careful observation, and the deep understanding of human nature that had grown quietly within her. Her children visited when possible, bringing warmth and conversation into the silent halls. And yet, the castle itself remained a place of reflection, where time moved slowly and the world outside could only reach her in small, measured increments. At night, she would often walk the garden paths beneath the pale winter moon. Snow crunched softly under her boots, the air crisp and clear. She allowed herself to feel the rhythm of life, slow, enduring, and entirely her own. The quiet of the castle, the gentle pulse of her lands, and the soft whispers of snow on stone carried a sense of peace that only came from years of careful stewardship and deep reflection. In those hours, Elizabeth understood that her life, full of diligence, thoughtfulness, and calm authority, had created something lasting. She was not merely a noblewoman or a widow, she was a presence, a force of steady wisdom that would linger in the hearts and minds of those around her long after the snow melted and the seasons turned again. Sedge Castle stood quietly atop the hill, its walls etched with decades of memory. Elizabeth moved through the halls with a slow certainty, her presence a steady pulse in the vast spaces of stone and timber. Time had softened the sharp edges of youth, but it had also deepened her understanding of the world, of people, and of the fragile, intricate patterns of influence. The estate was alive with its usual rhythms. Shepherds guided flocks across frost-covered meadows, millers tended the water wheels along the river, and gardeners prepared the beds for the coming spring. Elizabeth observed all of this with the patience of one who understood that life was composed of countless small acts, each contributing to the whole. Her children visited occasionally, bringing news of distant courts and cities, of political changes, and of their own families. She welcomed them with quiet warmth, offering counsel that was both firm and gentle. Her guidance extended beyond matters of land or wealth. She shared her understanding of character, of patience, of the way one's choices ripple across years and lives. Even as she nurtured the estate and advised her family, Elizabeth spent long hours alone, walking the gardens, reading manuscripts, and reflecting upon the subtle shifts in human behavior she had witnessed throughout her life. She noted how power could be wielded without force, how kindness could command loyalty, and how attention to detail could shape destiny as surely as armies or alliances. Rumors of her wisdom and judgment traveled slowly beyond Sedge, reaching neighboring lands and distant nobles. Some admired her with sincere respect, others whispered speculations, yet all acknowledged the quiet authority that emanated from her presence. Elizabeth did not concern herself with gossip. She understood that it was the unintentional consequence of living fully and distinctly. One cold evening, she sat by the window in her study, snow drifting softly across the valley. Candlelight reflected in the frost on the glass, and in that stillness, she considered the years behind her, the battles endured by her husband, the letters exchanged across distances, the countless decisions that had shaped her estates. Each memory was a stone laid carefully into the structure of her life, each choice a thread in the intricate tapestry of her legacy. In that quiet hour, she allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction, not in pride, but in the calm recognition that she had lived with intention, that she had created order and care in the world entrusted to her, and that the ripple of her influence would continue long after the candle had burned to its base. Spring returned gradually, the first buds appearing as delicate as whispers across the frost-softened earth. Elizabeth walked the garden paths slowly, her cloak trailing lightly on the gravel. The roses, carefully tended over the decades, began to bloom in gentle clusters, and the scent of lavender drifted through the air. Each plant, each flower, seemed to her a quiet companion in the passage of time, teaching patience and resilience through its subtle growth. She reflected on the years of her life, her early education in Transylvania, her marriage, the distant wars, the long periods of solitude, and the slow accumulation of wisdom and authority. She thought of the countless letters she had written, the advice she had given, and the delicate balance she had maintained between care and influence. Each act, each decision, each quiet observation contributed to the vast, unseen web of her life. Her children and grandchildren visited when the weather permitted, bringing vitality into the halls of the castle. Elizabeth welcomed them with calm joy, guiding them gently, offering lessons not only in land management or diplomacy but in patience, reflection, and the careful observation of human character. She had learned, over decades, that influence and legacy were born of steady attention, not haste or spectacle. Evenings were her own, a sacred space of reflection. She would sit by the fire, surrounded by the books and manuscripts that had been her companions through the years, reading slowly, absorbing not only words but the quiet rhythms of thought and history. Outside, the valley lay soft beneath the twilight, the village lights twinkling in gentle clusters like scattered stars. As night fell, she often walked the terrace alone. The moonlight touched the towers and gardens, casting long shadows that seemed to reach back across time. In these moments, she felt the pulse of life itself, the slow, enduring heartbeat of earth, stone, and memory. It was a rhythm that had guided her decisions, shaped her influence, and carried the quiet weight of her legacy. Elizabeth understood that life was not measured in dramatic events, but in the careful accumulation of small, intentional acts, the tending of the land, the guidance of family, the observation of people, and the cultivation of thought. Each day added to the story she was writing, not in ink alone, but in the living world around her. And so, as she paused beneath the moonlit roses, she allowed herself a final, quiet reflection. The world was vast, ever-changing, and often unpredictable, yet through patience, care, and quiet wisdom, one could leave a mark that endured, gentle yet lasting, like the soft light on snow or the first buds of spring after a long winter. The seasons continued their slow, deliberate march over Sedge Castle, each year layering the estate with new textures of life. Elizabeth, now entering her later years, moved through her world with the quiet precision of someone who had witnessed decades of change, loss, and careful triumph. The stones of the castle seemed almost to recognize her presence. Their worn surfaces held echoes of the footsteps, laughter, and quiet contemplation that had filled them over the years. Mornings began with observation. She would rise with the first pale light, walking the corridors while servants stirred quietly in the background. She inspected the estate meticulously, the condition of the barns, the flow of the river that turned the mill wheels, the care given to the livestock, and the growth of the crops. Nothing escaped her notice. Each element of her domain was part of a larger tapestry, and her mind catalogued every thread, ensuring harmony and balance in her lands. The villagers moved with a respect that bordered on reverence, not for fear, but for the clarity and steadiness she exuded. They spoke of her quietly in the evenings, often reflecting on how her judgments were fair and how her advice carried weight even beyond the castle walls. Traveling nobles who had visited once returned with stories of a woman whose calm authority shaped the rhythm of life around her. Elizabeth, however, never sought such acknowledgement. She viewed it as the natural outcome of diligence and care. Her children, grown and settled into their own lives, visited when the seasons allowed. Elizabeth received them with warmth tempered by quiet wisdom. She spoke with them about the land, about history, about character, guiding not by command, but by subtle counsel. Her words were often slow, deliberate, measured, leaving room for reflection and understanding. Through these teachings, she passed on the depth of experience she had accumulated over decades. Evenings were reserved for study and contemplation. Her library, lined with manuscripts of philosophy, history, and poetry, became a sanctuary. She read slowly, savoring every phrase, every insight. Sometimes she copied passages into her own journals, noting reflections that were part observation, part meditation. In these quiet hours, she allowed herself to think deeply about the past, the nature of influence, and the patterns of human behavior she had observed. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the estate, Elizabeth often paused at the terrace or in the gardens. The scent of herbs and roses drifted on the breeze, the gentle rustle of leaves whispered through the trees, and the distant village lights flickered like tiny stars across the valley. In these moments, she felt the vastness of the world and simultaneously her own quiet imprint upon it, subtle, enduring, unassuming, yet unmistakably present. Candlelight in her chambers reflected softly on the walls, illuminating her face as she wrote letters to distant relatives, scholars, and officials. Each word was precise and thoughtful, embodying the wisdom of one who understood that influence was not gained through force, but through attention, reflection, and patience. And in the silence that followed, when the ink dried and the letters were sealed, she allowed herself to simply breathe, immersed in the stillness of a life lived fully, deliberately, and with intention. Spring returned with subtle insistence, painting the gardens of sedge in delicate shades of green and gold. Tulips and daffodils swayed lightly in the morning breeze, roses unfolded slowly, and the scent of lavender filled the air. Elizabeth walked among them each day, her hands brushing over petals and leaves, noting the gentle signs of growth, change, and resilience. These gardens were not merely decoration, they were a living reflection of the care and attention she poured into every aspect of her life. She reflected often on the arc of her existence, the long years of youth, the responsibilities and challenges of marriage, the distance of her husband, the management of estates, and the countless small choices that had shaped her influence and legacy. Each memory seemed like a stone in a vast mosaic, part of a structure both delicate and enduring, illuminated by the subtle light of experience. Her children and grandchildren visited intermittently, bringing laughter, conversation, and life into the quiet corridors of the castle. She welcomed them with warmth and careful guidance, sharing wisdom on governance, patience, and observation. She taught not by assertion but by example, through the quiet management of her lands, the meticulous study of manuscripts, and the attentive consideration of every visitor and letter. Evenings were her own, sacred and uninterrupted. She would sit by the fire, candlelight flickering across her journals and manuscripts, and lose herself in thought. She reflected on history, philosophy, and the intricate threads that connect lives, decisions, and events. Every letter she wrote, every observation she recorded, became part of the enduring structure of her life, a map of thought and action laid carefully across decades. The castle itself seemed to participate in these reflections. The walls carried echoes of laughter, footsteps, and whispered conversations. The towers held the quiet rhythm of wind and weather. The gardens, in bloom or frost-covered, reflected the cycles of life, growth, and endurance. Elizabeth, moving through these spaces, felt herself intertwined with the world she had shaped and nurtured. At night, she often walked alone along the garden paths, the moon casting silver light on petals and frost alike. She allowed herself to consider the quiet legacy she had built, the attention given to her lands, the respect earned from neighbors and nobles, the influence held not through display, but through careful, deliberate action. She understood that a life of patience, observation, and quiet authority left a mark that was subtle yet enduring. As she paused beneath a blossoming rose bush, she breathed in the scent of spring, and in that gentle moment, she felt the fullness of her existence. The world was vast, yet she had carved a space within it, a space of order, care, reflection, and calm influence, lasting quietly across time. In the soft rustle of leaves, in the distant lights of the village, and in the rhythm of her own steady heartbeat, Elizabeth sensed the enduring truth of her life, that true strength is measured not by noise or spectacle, but by the quiet, patient shaping of the world around you, a garden of memory, of influence, and of enduring grace. The castle of Secht seemed to exhale slowly as the years layered over its stones. Time moved differently within its walls, measured not in grand events but in the subtle rhythms of daily life, the soft brushing of a servant's hand across a broom, the distant murmur of a river over stones, the occasional clatter of a carriage returning from a nearby village. Elizabeth moved among these rhythms like one attuned to the music of the world itself, each movement deliberate, each glance reflective. In her later years, she walked the corridors with slower steps, yet with the same calm authority that had marked her decades of governance. She paused often, touching the carved wood of doors and panels, tracing the worn edges of tables and window sills with a quiet reverence. Every stone, every timber, seemed to hold the echo of her life, footsteps, conversations, quiet laughter, and the soundless passage of thought. The gardens remained her sanctuary. Even in the chill of late winter or the gentle warmth of early spring, she wandered among the roses, the lilacs, the carefully cultivated herbs. She observed the subtle changes in each plant, noting the way a branch bent under frost or a bud swelled with the promise of bloom. To Elizabeth, the gardens were more than beauty, they were mirrors of life itself, teaching patience, resilience, and quiet endurance. Her correspondence continued, though now more reflective than strategic. Nobles, scholars, and family members wrote seeking guidance, and she answered with deliberate care. Each letter bore her measured hand, thoughtful phrasing, and the insight gained from decades of careful observation. She knew the value of silence as much as the value of words, and often, a single, well-chosen sentence carried more weight than pages of argument. At night, she walked the towers alone, her cloak heavy with the chill, her eyes following the river below as it reflected moonlight like a silver ribbon. The village lay quiet beneath the hill, lights glimmering softly through the darkness. She thought of the countless letters, decisions, and conversations that had shaped her life, and she felt the weight of her legacy, not a burdensome weight, but one of deep, quiet satisfaction. In these hours, she reflected on the paradoxes of life, solitude as power, patience as influence, observation as wisdom. She knew that much of her strength came from living quietly, from shaping her world without spectacle, from cultivating harmony in all things, people, land, and thought alike. Each memory settled gently into her understanding, like snowflakes landing on still water, forming layers of calm depth over the surface of her mind. Spring had fully returned to the valley, softening the harsh lines of winter with delicate green, pale gold, and the scent of early blooms. The castle gardens thrived under Elizabeth's attention, each rose and tulip a testament to years of patient care. She walked among them slowly each morning, her fingers lightly brushing leaves, noting growth, and remembering the lessons each season imparted. Though her body had begun to feel the years more keenly, her mind remained sharp and observant. She noticed everything, the rhythm of life in the village, the slow movement of clouds across the hills, the quiet patterns of birds returning to their nests. Even the tiniest details held meaning, and she carried them with her in her thoughts, linking them to lessons learned over decades. Her children and grandchildren visited more often during the spring and summer, bringing vitality and laughter to the quiet halls of the castle. Elizabeth received them with warmth tempered by wisdom, offering guidance that was gentle yet firm. She taught patience, careful observation, and the delicate art of influence, showing that true authority comes not from command, but from understanding, reflection, and care. Evenings were her most sacred hours. She would sit by the fire, candles flickering softly, and read manuscripts of philosophy, history, and poetry. Occasionally, she added notes in the margins, reflections on human nature, governance, and the passing of time. These notes, private and deliberate, were her meditations, small beacons of understanding in a world that moved too quickly for many to notice the depth of quiet reflection. She walked the terraces at night under the silver glow of the moon, feeling the rhythm of the estate beneath her feet. The snow, the soft murmur of the river, the gentle rustle of leaves, all carried a harmony that mirrored her inner world. In these moments, she contemplated her influence, the lives she had touched, and the subtle ways in which patience and attention could shape not only her estate but the legacy she would leave behind. Though centuries later people would tell stories of her with embellishment and mystery, Elizabeth understood the truth. Her life was not measured by rumors or legend, but by the quiet, enduring impact of her decisions, the care she gave to land and people, and the reflective, attentive way she had lived every day. And as she paused beneath the blooming roses, the valley bathed in moonlight and stars, she breathed deeply. She allowed herself to feel the fullness of her life, deliberate, calm, and enduring. The world was vast, ever-changing, yet through quiet observation, thoughtful action, and careful cultivation, she had carved a space that was entirely her own, a life of lasting grace, subtle power, and enduring light. The years had grown gentle with age, and Sedge Castle stood as a silent witness to decades of life, care, and quiet authority. The stones, warmed by sun and wind, bore the faint echoes of centuries, and Elizabeth moved among them with a measured grace that spoke of long experience. Each hall, corridor, and chamber had been part of her life for decades, and she navigated them with the calm knowledge of someone entirely attuned to her surroundings. Mornings began softly, the pale light of dawn spilling through tall windows, illuminating the intricate tapestries that lined the walls. She would move through the corridors, pausing at familiar spots, a window with a view of the river winding through the valley, a bench beneath the old oak in the courtyard, a carved table where her husband once wrote letters. These spaces, rich with memory, were companions to her reflections, places where the past and present merged gently. Her days were filled with the rhythm of observation. She inspected her lands carefully, the flow of streams and rivers, the growth of fields, the work of shepherds and farmers. She listened to the whispers of wind through the forests, noting subtle changes in weather, the quiet movements of animals, and the signs of approaching seasons. These observations were not mere habit, they were a form of understanding, a way to perceive life itself in its delicate interconnections. Her children and grandchildren visited more frequently now, drawn to the warmth of her presence and the wisdom she offered. She spoke to them of patience, attentiveness, and reflection, teaching through example the art of influence without domination. She guided not with sharp commands, but with gentle insight, allowing them to learn through conversation, observation, and quiet contemplation. Evenings were her sanctuary. She sat by the fire in her study, candlelight flickering across the pages of manuscripts and journals. She read slowly, absorbing philosophy, history, and poetry, occasionally adding reflections in the margins. These notes, private and meticulous, were her meditations on life, governance, and human character. She considered the intricate patterns of people's choices, the subtleties of behavior, and the long, quiet effects of small acts of care and attention. At night, she walked the terraces and gardens, feeling the soft pulse of life beneath her feet. The moonlight shimmered across the river, reflected in the frozen ponds of winter or the gentle waves of spring. The scent of flowers, herbs, and earth carried on the breeze, mixing with the distant sound of village life. In these moments, she contemplated her own influence, not in terms of fame or rumor, but as the quiet, lasting imprint of a life lived with awareness, patience, and deliberate care. The castle, the estate, and the surrounding lands had become extensions of her consciousness. She felt connected to them as one might feel connected to a trusted companion, aware of every subtle change, every pattern of movement, every ripple of life. In this twilight of wisdom, Elizabeth understood the depth of her own existence, a life composed of attention, reflection, and the gentle, enduring shaping of the world around her. Spring deepened into early summer, and the gardens of sedge glowed with the richness of life. Roses, tulips, and lavender stretched across meticulously maintained beds, their colors vivid under the warm sunlight. Elizabeth walked these paths daily, often alone, allowing herself to observe every detail, the curling of a leaf, the delicate emergence of a bud, the subtle changes in soil and light. These small observations were meditative, grounding her in the quiet rhythm of life that she had cultivated for decades. Her children and grandchildren continued to visit, bringing laughter and vitality to the castle halls. She welcomed them with warmth tempered by the deep wisdom of years. Conversations were slow and deliberate, full of reflection. She shared insights about patience, observation, and subtle influence, teaching them not merely about the management of lands or wealth, but about the art of living with intention and care. In her private hours, she sat in her study, surrounded by manuscripts, journals, and letters collected over a lifetime. She read slowly, savoring philosophy, poetry, and historical accounts. Her writing became increasingly reflective, not for others, but as a means of understanding the delicate web of cause and effect that wove through her own life. Each observation, each insight, was recorded with care, as if setting the patterns of her experience into the permanence of ink and paper. The castle itself seemed to respond to her presence, carrying the quiet hum of memory. The corridors echoed softly with footsteps long past, the stones retained the warmth of countless days, and the gardens held the accumulated scent of decades of care. She moved through these spaces with the awareness that her life, her attention, and her influence had transformed them into a living testament of quiet endurance. Evenings were often spent in reflection on the terrace, watching the sun set over the valley. The rivers glinted gold, the fields softened in the fading light, and the distant village lights shimmered gently like scattered stars. She thought of her correspondence, her careful management of the estate, her guidance of family, and the quiet impact of decades spent observing, reflecting, and shaping her world with patience. Her legend had begun to grow subtly beyond sedged. Stories of her wisdom, fairness, and composure circulated quietly, told in hushed tones across villages and among visiting nobles. Some tales carried embellishment, but all reflected the underlying truth. She had lived deliberately, influencing her world through attentiveness, reflection, and calm authority. And yet, she never sought recognition. Her satisfaction lay in the living patterns she had created, a subtle, enduring network of care and guidance. In the final years of her life, Elizabeth moved through sedged with the serene grace of someone fully at peace with herself and the world she had shaped. Each morning began with the observation of light across the hills, the gentle movements of the river, and the whispers of the gardens. Every detail mattered to her, for even the smallest observation could reveal the rhythms and connections of life in ways both practical and profound. Her children and grandchildren visited often, carrying the energy of youth into the calm halls of the castle. She shared her insights slowly, speaking in measured phrases that allowed thought to unfold like petals in the sun. Her guidance, always subtle and deliberate, had the effect of shaping not through command, but through understanding, example, and the quiet power of patience. Evenings were the most sacred hours. She sat by candlelight, reading manuscripts and reflecting on her life. The walls of the castle seemed to breathe with the memory of her steps, and the gardens, in bloom or shadowed by twilight, mirrored the cycles of life she had observed for decades. Each letter, each journal entry, each deliberate decision contributed to a tapestry of quiet influence that extended far beyond the walls of Sejd. At night, she walked alone along the terraces, under a moonlit sky that glimmered like silver across the valley. She paused often, breathing in the scents of the gardens, listening to the distant river, and feeling the gentle pulse of life all around her. In these moments, she reflected not on fame, fortune, or rumor, but on the deliberate, enduring ways she had shaped her world, a life lived fully, with care, attention, and quiet authority. Her legend, eventually whispered in villages and noble courts alike, spoke of the Lady of Sejd with reverence, admiration, and a touch of mystery. Yet to her, it was never the recognition that mattered. What mattered was the steady imprint of her actions, the gardens tended with care, the lands managed thoughtfully, the family guided gently, and the estate shaped with patience and reflection. As she rested finally in the quiet of her chambers, the moonlight resting on her face, Elizabeth understood the full measure of her life. It had been deliberate, calm, and enduring, a life of attention, wisdom, and subtle influence, leaving behind a legacy not of noise or spectacle, but of quiet strength, lasting grace, and the soft, unbroken rhythm of care. The castle breathed around her, the garden swayed gently in the night breeze, and the valley below slept under the watch of stars. And in this final, serene moment, Elizabeth closed her eyes, the Lady of Sejd, content in the enduring imprint of a life fully and deliberately lived.